Vietnam Fall and Women Get It All. I am, as always, your host, Christopher Paul Dugdale, MEDMA. We are Duncanville High School in these United States, and today is April 9th, 2021. And on this date in history, 156 years ago today, the Civil War ended when Lee surrendered to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. He actually signed the paperwork in the same guy's house that the first shots of the Civil War were fired at. So this will be great. Lincoln will live forever, and the war is over. The Civil War is over, everyone. Congratulations. Swan versus the Charlotte Mecklenburg Board of Education. So remember when we talked about Brown versus Board of Education and how a lot of people thought that that really opened up the schools? The truth is, people just redistrict and put white kids in the white school, black kids in the black school, and they could redraw district lines and put one person in the middle of a neighborhood in another district. It was really easy to do. That kind of goes back to the whole reapportionment idea that I also spoke to you about. So in 1971, to desegregate schools, the government started implementing busing. This is transporting kids to schools in other neighborhoods for racial balance. Uh, Generally, what they would do is light skinned black people would go to the white schools, and the white students that they would send to the black schools were Hispanic students. So, uh, this caused something called white flight. This is where white students left for parochial and private schools, including 20,000 people in Boston. Now, you can also move to different areas where there's less racial balance. They did that in Duncanville. Many people moved to Midlothian during that time. If you don't believe me, go over and look at the drill team pictures. In 1992, 2 black students. In 1995, 5 white students. It was a drastic change. Now, let's talk about an economic miracle, but not in a good way. During the 1970s, they had this amazing situation called stagflation. You had inflation or rising prices and economic stagnation. So the economy wasn't doing anything at all. In fact, it was kind of shrinking. People were making less money or no money because of unemployment, but the prices of everything were going up. This is something that people believed were impossible, that would never happen. Yet in America, we can do anything, even destroy our economy in interesting ways. Part of the problem was when the U.S. rebuilt Germany and Japan after World War II, and their products were better and cheaper. Also, cheap oil is no longer accessible, and we're going to get into that soon. Uh, so, in 1971, Nixon officially ended the gold standard. So, we also didn't have anything keeping our money at a stable value. So, that's one of the reasons that this was so bad in the 70s. Hope everyone's having a good day today. It's a beautiful day outside. If you get a chance, look out the window or have someone take a picture of outside so you can enjoy it. By the way, for some students who may not know, we are in quarantine, which means you're not supposed to go outside. So some of you may have just been playing on your video games and not noticed and thought, well, maybe mom won't notice if I don't go to school. Well, the joke's on you? Question mark. Energy crisis. So there's a lot of conflict in the Middle East between Israel and the other countries. Many of the other countries in the area wanted to destroy Israel. So uh, Egypt and Syria will go to war with Israel several times. During one of the conflicts in 6 days, Israel was able to defeat the forces of Egypt, Syria, and Jordan, all in 6 days. In 1973, uh, Egypt and Syria tried to invade Israel again and were once again beaten by the Israelis. Uh, Israel and the U.S. thought the Soviets were behind the attacks, or at least Israel convinced the U.S., and if the Soviets were involved, we always got involved. So, in response, in 1973, many of the oil the countries with large amounts of oil banded together. The Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries announced an embargo or stopped shipping oil to any countries that supported Israel. People sat in line for oil and gas for sometimes hours. If you had a license plate that ended with an odd number or A through K, you could get gas on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. And if you fell, I'm sorry, in 0 through 4 and A through K. And if it fell on the other part of the alphabet or the other numbers, 5 through 9, then you could only get it on Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday. And no one bought gas on Sunday. So, kind of like when we had the oil shortage a few years ago. That really didn't happen. So, Nixon starts to attack the Supreme Court because of all of its liberal rulings, everything to protect uh, accused criminals, and he started appointing conservative judges. Also, to try and control spending throughout the United States and keep states from spending as much money as they wanted, he created something called New Federalism, and this is where Congress passes revenue sharing bills that gives federal funds to state and local agencies. What this means is the federal government has more control over the day-to-day lives of the everyday people. Chevy commercial for everyday people. Actually, I don't remember what it is. I've been alone in this room for a long time. Just kidding, my wife's sitting next to me. Henry Kissinger. So Nixon's trying to find a way to end the Vietnam War. He appoints a former Harvard professor by the name of Henry Kissinger to be his national security advisor. Many people, once they heard the resume of Henry Kissinger, believed that he was an intelligent guy being a Harvard professor. By the way, just because you go to Harvard or you're a Harvard professor doesn't mean that you're intelligent. Kissinger tried a new program called Linkage to improve relations with the Soviet Union and China to end the war in Vietnam. The truth is, a majority of supplies that the North Vietnamese army and the Kong were using came from the Soviet Union and China. So if we had better relationships with those two countries, they might not supply all the weapons and planes uh, to the North Vietnamese or the Viet Cong. This also starts a process called Vietnamization. This is gradually withdrawing U.S. troops in Vietnam and letting the South Vietnamese fight instead. Several U.S. troops were upset that they were risking their lives and the South Vietnamese were going about their normal lives. And they thought that they should have more of a part in the war. We also do the Vietnamization process in Iraq about 12, 13 years ago. At this time, the Vietnam War was very unpopular, so Nixon started a new doctrine called the Nixon Doctrine. And this said that the U.S. would honor its commitments but send money instead of troops to other Asian conflicts, so that no more Americans had to die fighting communism in Asia. The Miley Massacre. In 1968, Lieutenant Calley's platoon killed 347 unarmed South Vietnamese civilians. Now, I know you might be a little bit confused. Weren't we protecting the South Vietnamese? And the answer is yes. So why would he kill so many South Vietnamese civilians? The truth was the Viet Cong was able to recruit South Vietnamese civilians. What they would do is break into a house where there might be mom and dad and 4 children, and they'd walk in and shoot the first child as they walked in the door. Then they would command the family to do something for the Viet Cong. If they didn't do that, they already had proved that they would execute a hostage or child in the house. So the families would reluctantly help out the Viet Cong. Sometimes they would welcome it because they were tired of the U.S. in the area. There were a lot of American troops that felt the same way as Lieutenant Calley, that they were frustrated that the government wouldn't let them really fight the war they needed to. And I have family members who said that they would line up all the South Vietnamese and start shooting them until they revealed who was really in the Viet Cong. By the way, it doesn't excuse the killing of civilians. Uh, this was hidden for 2 years, but once it came out, it really lowered support for the war. Uh, American troops returned from Vietnam to crowds screaming baby killers. And about this time, it also is revealed just how bad things were, where 730 uh, people, U.S. troops, were killed uh, in friendly fire attacks by people they commanded. So U.S. troops rebelled and killed their commanding officer. About this time also, the Pentagon Papers were released. These are secret documents that were leaked by former Defense Department worker Daniel Ellsberg, and it showed how LBJ was deceiving the public about Vietnam. Also, how Nixon was deceiving the public about Vietnam. Both Nixon and LBJ had claimed to be that they were trying to leave Vietnam, while they were also sending in more troops and fighting in Cambodia and Laos. Nixon tried to prevent its publication, but it got out. He was furious, but it was too late at this point. So, as mentioned on the last slide, the US invaded Cambodia with South Vietnam to attack Viet Cong secret bases. If you remember, we talked about the Ho Chi Minh Trail that went through Cambodia and Laos. And so the Viet Cong could sneak into South Vietnam, attack, and then run back across the border. And they had several bases hidden in Cambodia and Laos. So the US went and attacked. We were forced to pull out our troops once the public found out because they were infuriated. So when we moved out, a man by the name of Pol Pot, pictured up on the top left, took over Cambodia, and he started an ethnic cleansing of Cambodia, and he killed 1 out of every 3 people in the nation, or 2 million people. We had so many genocides in the 20th century that his is almost forgotten, but he killed well over 2 million people. There are a collection of skulls and bones up at the top pictures. Please don't make me explain which one's which. Okay, I will. Left Pol Pot, middle skulls, right bones and skeletons. So, Kent State. So when news comes out about what's happening in Cambodia, a bunch of students were protesting at Kent State, and the National Guard will panic and shoot into the crowd, killing 4 students. In the picture on the right, that girl's not yelling out plank, and that person's not doing a perfect plank. That person is dead, and she's screaming for help. Well, all right then. The 26th Amendment at this time lowered the voting age to 18. I know you're wondering, what amendments do I need to know for this test? I would say the 24th, 25th, and 26th. The 24th Amendment was getting rid of the poll tax. The 26th Amendment is lowering the voting age to 18. And next week, we'll cover the 25th Amendment because it's more appropriate that way. Richard Nixon comes up with another scheme. How do you get North Vietnam to the negotiating table? By bombing them more. So he and Kissinger played good cop, bad cop. Kissinger would go in and offer a deal to North Vietnam and say, please take it, Nixon's crazy. And when North Vietnam would refuse, Nixon would bomb them. So, not the best strategy if you want peace. Detente. Okay, so the only pleasant thing about all of this is to not hear a bunch of students pronounce this detente. It's called detente. It's a French term, and this is Kissinger's plan. Basically, we could relax tensions between the U.S., Soviet Union, and China. and try and improve relationships. So Nixon visited China to open relations with the Soviet Union. Uh, the Soviet Union was by far the larger enemy of the two, and the more fearsome. But by opening up and visiting China, the Soviets got curious and they allowed Nixon to visit also. Now, this is something that the Democrats couldn't have done, mainly because Nixon was such a staunch opponent of communism. He helped with the McCarthy trials of the 1950s. He was Eisenhower's vice president, and so it put him in a unique situation here. Had the Democrats tried to do the same, then it would have been pointed at that they were friends with communists all along and that they were untrustworthy. And so even until in 1979, the Democrats still have to go wildly against communism every time there's some type of Soviet incursion. Let's also talk about the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, also known as SALT. This was a this was a treaty negotiated between Nixon and Brezhnev. Okay, this would limit nuclear weapons, and both nations would agree to share scientific information between each other, the U.S. and Soviet Union. That way, there were less atomic bombs being blown up in the world. By the way, between the two countries, they tested nearly 1,800 atomic bombs that were blown up in the atmosphere. So, as promised by Nixon, on January 27, 1973, 4 years and 1 week into his presidency, so 1 week into his second term, they signed a treaty in Paris with Vietnam, and this ends the Vietnam War. The U.S. would withdraw all of its troops. They would receive back 560 POWs, or prisoners of war, and they negotiated all this without South Vietnam, which makes South Vietnam quite angry at the United States. So 2 years after this happens, North Vietnam invades and unites South Vietnam. Nguyen Van Tu, the leader of South Vietnam, asks Ford for help, and Ford asks Congress, but Congress says no. This is shortly after Nixon's impeached and no one wanted to go back to war. North Vietnam captured Saigon, which was the capital of South Vietnam, and renamed it Ho Chi Minh City in honor of its former leader. The U.S. would evacuate 140,000 South Vietnamese as it left. This sounds like this would be a lot of people, but the truth is there were almost 400,000 that they didn't evacuate that were unmercilessly executed by squads. Anyone who was any way related to the United States, if you helped in any way whatsoever or were accused of helping the United States in any way, you and your entire family were wiped out. The legacy of Vietnam. It was the longest U.S. war, from 1959 to 1975. In truth, we were there really in one way or another for 30 years. They called it the 10,000 Day War. It cost about $150 billion. That's about how much we spend in Afghanistan every every 5 months. By the way, we've been in Afghanistan longer than probably just about everyone in this class has been alive. There were 58,000 deaths, 300,000 people wounded, 100,000 people were missing a limb, and about 150,000 people had psychological or drug problems. Also, a lot of Americans doubted whether we received back all of our POWs, and in the mid to late 1980s, 10 to 15 years after this was over, still believed that there were POWs in camps in Vietnam. You also had a large number of missing in action where we had no idea whatever happened to them. So their families to this day still have no clue. So the War Powers Act was passed. Now, if you remember the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, LBJ received all the powers of Congress to declare and wage war. It went to him and it went to Nixon. So now there are limitations on the president. Okay. If the president decides to move any troops anywhere, he has to tell Congress about it within 48 hours. And then they have to remove them in 60 days unless Congress approves of the troop movement. So basically, you can wage a 62-day war as president, and that's all. Otherwise, Congress has to approve of the war. Now it's time for happier time. Look, we're back to civil rights. See the civil rights slide in the bottom left-hand corner of the Supreme Court, or it just says court. Well, anyway, Title IX was passed. In 1972, this prohibits federally funded schools from discriminating against girls' athletics. So this would be any state schools or colleges and any public schools. So you're supposed to spend the same amount of money for boys and girls' athletics. So how does football get so much money? They apparently raise it outside of that. Bless you to my dog. That was George. George sneezed. I think he's allergic to equal rights between males and females. I'm trying to fix him on that. We're taking him to obedience training so that he listens to boys and girls. Right now, my wife's not too impressed by it. Are you, hon? She said no. Roe versus Wade. This said abortion was legal the first 3 months of pregnancy. So you could abort a baby for any reason whatsoever. That case actually starts out of Dallas, Texas, and goes all the way to the Supreme Court. On an ironic note, the woman that started the case, by the time it went to court, her baby was about 18 months old. And about 3 to 4 years later, she decides to go to the other side and go with pro-life, and she becomes a proponent for ending abortion in the United States. Somewhat of an irony. Equal Rights Amendment, or the ERA. This was going to be an amendment that would protect against gender discrimination in the United States and finally protect women. But for all of you who remember how this works, in order for an amendment to be ratified, you need 3/4 of the states to sign off on it. That's 38 states total. In the 10-year period that they had to get 38 states to approve, only 35 states approved. So I guess you can discriminate against women now. So way to go, United States. We really offended women. So not all women were in favor of the Equal Rights Amendment, and that would lead to Phyllis Schlafly down at the bottom. She had a movement called Stop ERA. Okay, and she thought that if women were given equal rights, it would undermine traditional family. Also, it would take away a woman's right to be supported by their husbands. It would lead to women having to serve in combat and gay marriage. By the way, there's gay marriage now. If there were a war, women would have to serve in combat. But a woman does have a right to be supported by her husband, and some men have the right to be supported by their wives, and a few men have the right to be supported by their husbands. And I'm sure that there's some women out there who have the right to be supported by their wives. Okay, I think I'm trailing off. Now it's time for some ecological disasters and some attempts to save the environment. And now we end another day of notes. I hope you're all happier and healthier. I miss you all, and hopefully I'll see you soon. This is Mr. Dugdale signing off.